Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Good morning, and it's great to see you 9 a.m. on a Saturday. Oh, remarkable. So I have a couple of housekeeping items. One, all speakers, can you give a copy of your slide decks to the registration desk, please? That would be really helpful. We'll put them up as soon as we can. The other thing is that information about airport transport, there's a leaflet there, a page that you can pick up, and they can help you arrange transport to the airport, which can take time.
I'm looking for this.
The other thing
I think I'm switched on.
On the way out from this session at the break, there's a leaflet announcing next year's eScience 2010, which will be held in partnership with the Berkeley Water Centre, College of Engineering, and the College of Natural Resources, and London's Berkeley Laboratory at UC Berkeley. And it will be mid-October next year, and we'll put the website. There will be a website, and there's certainly an email you can ask for more details. So you can pick up one of those as you go out. Well, I'm very pleased to be able to introduce my colleague, Stephen Emmett. Stephen joined Microsoft about the same time as me, just slightly before, I think, and started a very new multidisciplinary group where in the Cambridge Laboratory, Cambridge, England, as opposed to the US, and has really, in a very few years, built a remarkable group. And what Stephen's going to tell you about are some of the visions and some of the work that's going on with the Cambridge Computational Science Laboratory. Stephen.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Tony. So anyway, well, thanks very much, everyone, for turning up. I'm amazed there's anybody here, given the fact that it's 9 a.m. on a Saturday morning. So I'm hoping that you're all natural early risers, because otherwise it probably wasn't worth it. I'm a bit unclear why I've been invited to give a keynote, and well, quite unclear altogether, actually. And I'm fairly confident that by the end of this talk, you'll have also arrived at the same conclusion. But I'll do my best. So I should just briefly say something about my lab. So about 3 years ago, although I've been in Microsoft nearly 5 years, about 3 years ago, set up a lab, computational science lab, which is basically focused. Our whole work is focused on developing a better understanding of complex natural systems, and it's full of, I suppose, fairly unusual people from Microsoft, so theoretical ecologists, plant biologists, oceanographers, mathematical biologists, neuroscientists, zoologists, which I'm told by the theoretical ecologists it's a very good party piece. When you say, I work at Microsoft, and you say, what do you do? And I say, I'm a theoretical ecologist. It seems to go down quite well, with people screw their face up. So, yes, I'm going to give a talk largely about, I suppose, most of the, to use a footballing parlance, this is a talk of two halves, and the first half is basically about the sort of motivation for what we do, and the second half is a very, apologies in advance, a very brief fly through some of the work, some of the work that we're actually doing, and I'll talk in a little bit of detail about a few projects. So, yes, I think the title of the talk is Some Challenges in Natural Science. As I mentioned earlier, the whole focus of my lab's work, we have three groups, an ecology group, a biology group, and a tools group. And the whole focus of our work is on, as I said earlier, developing a better understanding of complex natural systems, or how living things work. And that takes us into territory all around theory, developing better theory, developing better models, and developing better tools for one form or another, whether it's computational tools or tools for acquisition of new kinds of data. But we're primarily a modelling group. We build, I suppose, what one might want to call new kinds of models. So it was a bit of a surprise and a bit of a disappointment then to discover about a year ago in that venerable scientific journal, Wired, that we didn't appear to have a job any longer. So I think Timo Hane mentioned this yesterday, and although the end of theory might have been a bit strong, and even Timo tried to disassociate himself with that. There's a more important point here, which is, and it's one that not just Wired made a year ago, but is gaining a lot of, I suppose, credence, which is the ability to collect petabytes of data is enabling us to find answers to fundamental questions. That's an interesting statement, making the scientific method obsolete. In the age of big data, more isn't just more is different. So I thought before I actually clear my desk, I'll just actually see whether there's actually just how far I am away from being out of a job for the rest of my life. So I just thought, what could be the most fundamental questions that we face? Well, as I said earlier, all of our work is on developing a better understanding of complex natural systems. I think that there's a broader issue. I suppose more broadly what we do is trying to understand what's required to develop a precise science of complex natural systems, of a new natural science that's precise and predictive. And I think that's going to be important because I think it's understanding complex natural systems and the requirement of a precise science of complex natural systems to understand how living things work underpins the greatest challenge for this century, which is what's happening to the planet that we live on, and also underpins it's going to underpin the next century and the next revolution of medicine and understanding disease. So the first fundamental question that we've been asking for some time, but I don't think it gets much more fundamental than this, which is how do living things work? So despite 50 years of undoubted and unquestionable spectacular achievement of molecular biology, and I've heard a lot of talks both yesterday and of course at conferences over the last few years on the achievements that have been made in molecular biology over the last 50 years, we still are nowhere near understanding how living things work. And this isn't just my conclusion, this is a conclusion of a recent paper by Paul Nurse, Nobel laureate, in Nature a few months ago, and who made a very compelling case of saying that beyond just at the basic biochemical level, we have absolutely no understanding, despite 50 years of molecular biology, how living things work. So we don't understand how even a cell works. We certainly can't predict much about what cells do. We have even less understanding about the one thing that's between us all and the cemetery, our immune system, how that works. And despite knowing quite a bit about all 959 cells of a C. elegans, a very some sense simple, but model organism in biology, we're not able to predict anything about its behavior really. Moreover, of course, I'm not telling anybody anything they don't already know. We're saying, despite 100 years of neuroscience and 50 years of technology-driven advances in neuroscience, and certainly 10 years of remarkable technological advances in neuroscience, we're really not much nearer in understanding how the brain works than we were 100 years ago with Kayal. And we have absolutely no idea whatsoever how the two things on the end work as a consequence of that. Largely speaking, I realize I'm making some generalizations here, but largely speaking, despite all those advances in molecular biology, we still don't know how to fix living things when they're broken, apart from bits stitching bits on, sewing bits off, putting things back in or taking them out. Most diseases are system-level diseases, and even when we know something about the genetic basis of those diseases, we don't really know how to fix it. when they're broken. We know very little about disease, and certainly not how to prevent it or cure it as system-level diseases. I think it was Carl yesterday mentioned about something about pandemics, HIV pandemic. He was talking about 3 million a year being killed by HIV and AIDS, and we know very little about pandemics, about the conditions that create pandemics, and we're certainly unable to predict or prevent a global pandemic. In the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, it was originally thought that about 25 to 50 million people were killed in a fairly short time frame, and revisions to that, recent revisions to that figure suggest that 100 million people might have died as a consequence of the pandemic. More recent work suggests that if you factor into how people travel these days, that a similar pandemic might kill as many as 1 billion people, and that's a big number of people. And the consequences of that would mean that obviously, almost certainly, civilization would more or less break down. So actually, the fact that we know virtually nothing about how to predict or prevent a global pandemic is quite alarming and important to try and do so. More generally, as a consequence of many of the things that I've just very cursorily just summarised, it's clear that predictive biology is almost unheard of. We have a lot of facts about biology, about parts and about reactions, and currently, well, this is my claim. I'm happy to be challenged on this, and I suspect I will be. But we have a lot of facts, but that's all we have. The problem is that function and behaviour is not actually obvious from this parts list or their reactions. So more recently, around about 2000, there's been this big move towards what's called systems biology. And you might want to characterise that really as omics of one form or another. It's genomics, proteomics, metabolomics. So this is really kind of one of collecting enormous amounts of data and then analysing that data and trying to infer something about the interaction between parts in networks. And the consequence of that is you end up with things like this. So this is a metabolic network map of the MAP kinase pathway. It's produced in Cell Designer, which is an interesting and pretty useful software tool out of Hiraki Kitano's lab. And the interesting thing about this is it's certainly complicated. But the other interesting thing about it, it describes the MAPK cascade and pathway. It doesn't explain it. And there's very little dynamics in here. And living things are characterized by dynamic, discrete but dynamic processes. So there's very limited utility in actually being able to explain rather than describe how living things work with this new systems biology approach in this form. We do get a lot more facts, which I'm sure are very useful, but that's all we get. And I suppose I would characterize this. Anybody who's read the Lazenbeek paper of 2002, Could a Biologist Fix a Radio? If you didn't find it funny, there's something seriously wrong. If you haven't read it, I recommend it being compulsory reading for all your students. But you might want to consider the network diagram from Cell Designer, from the map cascade, to something like this, which is I could probably produce and generate an enormous amount of data about how this radio works, about the size of the objects and their colour and their relative position to others. I can probably turn it around and describe the circuit diagram and talk about all the wires, but none of that would actually enable me to explain how a radio works. And I think that's the state that we're in systems biology at the moment. Systems biology seems to have also hoovered up mathematical approaches, and the problem with mathematical approaches traditional mathematical approaches is that it's pretty difficult to actually understand, for example, what ODEs a sea urchin would obey. And so I don't think the current mathematical approaches get us much further. I just want to kind of think about how we would characterize the state of biological science in 2009 by, I suppose, ripping off the idea of Lazenbyk on how could a biologist fix a Tamagotchi, and stealing some ideas from a colleague of mine, Luca Cardelli, to make what was once a nice story dreadful, but I'll give it a go. So here we are, this Tamagotchi niponenis, this lovely organism. Anybody who can remember them will remember them as just wonderful things. And they come in all manner of types, or they did. So the point I want to make is that if we wanted to understand how to fix a Tamagotchi, certainly mechanistic approaches fail. So removing components of a Tamagotchi is either ineffective, inconclusive, or fatal. The Tamagotchi folding problem, which is essentially understanding the sequence of manufacturing stages in a factory we've never even seen, called nature, is first of all far too hard. And even if we could figure it out, which we probably can't, it probably reveal very little about function. Behavioural approaches fail. If you subject a Tamagotchi to extreme conditions, it's actually going to reveal probably very little about normal function, and unfortunately voids the warranty, so you're in deep trouble. So you've wasted your money. And they don't respond consistently to stimuli. They have individual stochastic variations. Ecological approaches fail in understanding how Tamagotchis work. So they're very difficult to study in their native environment, which is a Japanese schoolgirl's hands. And they evolved in this absolutely unfathomable consumer goods market in Japan. So you're not going to find out much about Tamagotchi in that. And mathematical approaches fail. So, what ODEs does a Tamagotchi obey, as I mentioned earlier? I would argue that also, I have to apologise, by the way, for skipping. There's quite a lot. I'm skipping over all sorts of interesting stuff, which you'll no doubt pull me over the carpet for later. So system approaches fail. So this is the omics. It's the equivalent of putting 300 Tamagotchis in a carrier bag, shaking vigorously and taking some statistics of their final state and inferring something about how they work from that. And the problem with that is that we just get more facts about bits of Tamagotchi. We don't actually lead us too much about. It doesn't lead us too much about to a greater understanding of what Tamagotchis do, how they work. The interesting thing about Tamagotchis is that the hardware is almost identical to a digital watch, and the hardware is absolutely identical in each Tamagotchi, but they have very different behaviours, which is determined by their software. And a more general point, which I'll get onto later, is that we need to think about living things in terms of living software, rather than just about living chemistry or living machinery or living parts. So, fundamental question 1 hasn't got us very far. So I might still have a job, despite Wired's claim that collecting petabytes of data, which is what we've done in biology, is enabling us to answer fundamental questions, because I don't believe that we have answered, or anywhere near answering the fundamental question of how living things work. That doesn't mean to say we have to throw all the data away, but I'll come back to that. So the fundamental question 2 is, how does the Earth system work? And that's quite important because we rely on it for our survival, and more importantly, we're making fundamental alterations to it as a consequence of, yes, climate change, but also population growth. We're at 6 point something billion now, and all forecasts suggest that we will reach at least 11 billion by the end of the century, 9 billion in 40 years. And some estimates are already revising 11 billion up to 12 billion, barring a pandemic, which may well happen. And so we're consuming, as a consequence of that, many of the Earth's resources, in fact most of them, at a far greater rate than nature can replace them. We're consuming all manner of things that we probably don't need to consume. We are increasingly polluting the planet. By the way, there is more wood burnt, there is more black carbon produced now in 2009 than was used in the Middle Ages, which is quite remarkable. But it doesn't, as a proportion, it's not as great a proportion as oil, but there is an enormous amount of black carbon produced from wood-burning stoves in the third world countries, which, another talk, produces all manner of other unhealthy side effects and shortens many tens of millions of people's life expectancy every year. Interesting to know about this picture. Again, it's probably a subject for another talk, and I know I sound like some sort of green tree-hugging campaigner or something, but this is a river, as you can probably see. About 20 years ago, this river, which is in Indonesia, supported I think it was about 250,000 fishermen for a livelihood in actually catching fish. As you can see, there's no fish in here, and everybody has to just try and make a living from recycling rubbish. And a lot of this rubbish comes from countries like America and England. Most scientists would now concur that we've embarked on the greatest, as a consequence of all of that lot, we've embarked on the greatest mass extinction of life on the planet, and certainly in geological times, a far faster and greater mass extinction of life than the event that caused 65 million years ago, probably the hitting on the Earth of an asteroid, a very large asteroid, that wiped out most of life on Earth. And that took several thousand years, it turns out. And we've managed to already wipe out about 30% of all species on the planet in about 150 years. And we're accelerating that, not declining it, despite the fact that we know the problem. All of that, consequence is that we are risking rapid loss of our life support system. I think it was Ellen yesterday who said, she almost apologized for saying something about we're losing our life support system as if it was some fluffy thing that you shouldn't really say and we should talk about money instead. But I don't actually think there's anything wrong with talking about this, because it's a big danger to us all, and anybody with children or grandchildren in the audience, it's not entirely clear that the planet's going to be a nice place to live by the time that they are your age or my age. So interestingly, all this fluffy, we're losing our species and all the rest of it, has caught the attention of economists. So, chief economist of Deutsche Bank recently published a report which claimed, it's actually a fairly well-written report, that nature's loss dwarfs the current bank crisis, and that we're just on forests alone, the annual loss is between 2 and 5 trillion a year in loss of forests. So, there are some, I think it was Ellen talking about the economic consequences, and I think this is tip of the iceberg stuff. So it's a big deal, is what's happening to the planet. In terms of data, to understand the problem, we're not short of data. We are measuring the wazoo out of just about everything on Earth, through satellites, through measuring technology, sensor networks, in the ocean and in our terrestrial sensor networks. And it's producing, yes, petabytes of data, all very helpful. But the problem is, none of that data and none of that technology enables us to answer this, which is, what do forests do, or what does the microbial community do? And that's important because 70% of all the world's CO2 is sequestrated by forests and microbes. It's habitat to 80% of the world's biodiversity, and we're destroying it at a rapid rate. 50% of the biomass of the planet is probably microbes. In your average 1 gram of soil, there are 10 to the 9 microbes and around 10 to the 5 species in 1 gram of soil. And of course, biotic aspects of the planet are the basis of the planet's bioenergetic network, food webs, which we ultimately rely on for our food and water. So what's the state of Earth system science? Certainly in 2007, and nothing much has changed. Well, I'll give you a quick history, which is only as recently as 1990, I know it seems a long time ago, we were stuck with a very simple atmospheric physics model of the climate system. As recently as 2001, this is from Hadley, by the way, with permission. So as recently as 2001, the physicists figured out that actually there was something else going on, so that we developed a general circulation model, which included something in the carbon cycle, well done physicists, something about aerosols. And then as recently as 2007, it's only 2 years ago, the physicists decided that they might want to ask the biology about what they thought. And they also thought we should think about inviting the chemists to this. So the latest Hadley model includes something about atmospheric chemistry, but this is an important one about vegetation interaction. And it's basically all the current state-of-the-art Earth system models think of vegetation as a black box linear system, and they're anything but that. And to make the point, sorry, there's a lot of text on this. I'll read it if you're unable to read it. To hammer home the point about the importance of forests in particular, and how they're not represented in all current state-of-the-art Earth system models. Okay, there's some work going on in dynamic global vegetation models, but even that has some shortcomings. So, plant communities are vital to Earth system regulation, but their role and sensitivity... This comes from one of the world's leading ecologists, by the way, Steve Pacala. Plant communities are vital to Earth system regulation, but their role and sensitivity to changes is currently barely understood. Scaling from physiology to ecosystems is currently skipped over in Earth system models, ignores non-linearities in whole plants, interactions between plants within species, interactions between species, or how whole plants respond, growth and mortality, to resources and competition, and dynamics of forest community. It's the single most important outstanding issue in Earth system modelling, in understanding how our planet works. So forest dynamics is a big issue. I'm not going to spend too much time on this in the interest of time, but similarly for coccolithophores, they're at the basis of the food chain. Coccolithophores, I think Ellen mentioned them yesterday. At the basis of the food chain, they produce dimethyl sulfide, which is one of the conditions for formation of many of our clouds, and they're central to sequestration of carbon, or may become a carbon source rather than a carbon sink. If acidification of the ocean, slight acidification of the ocean continues with increasing temperature, increasing temperature rise with climate change, and that would be bad news for all of us. By the way, in terms of communities, these are large communities. They can sometimes be the size of continents. And anyone who wants to see what coccolithophores can look like, the next time you're sailing into Dover and you see the White Cliffs of Dover, the White Cliffs of Dover are solid coccolithophores. So, in terms of understanding how the planet works, we need better models, because that's all we've got, because we don't have a lot of data about the future, and we need them urgently. So, in this game of two halves, I just want to give you, bang on time, I just want to give you a half-time summary, because that was a fairly rapid fly-through, a lot of stuff. So, what biological science, earth system science, natural science so far have given us, in conjunction with what's been an amazing technologically driven expansion of data available to scientists, is a lot of facts. We've got a lot of data. But as Martin Fisher says, facts are not science, no more than the dictionary is literature. And that's an important point. Two is, I'm glad to say, for a group that does a lot of theory, rumours of the death of theory have been greatly exaggerated by Wired, at least. And three is that, yes, complex natural systems are unfortunately really complex. And I think this is an important point because I mentioned earlier about how could a biologist fix a Tamagotchi. Existing, well-established scientific approaches really fail in understanding such complex, highly nonlinear, highly concurrent, and highly reactive and dynamic systems. So we do need new approaches. So what's required to make some fundamental progress in natural science and a science of complex natural systems? Okay, so the talk is full of problems rather than full of solutions, I should warn you from here on. And I don't really know the answer. What I will do is give you some insights into the approach that we're taking in my lab of where we might find some solutions, or at least make some fundamental progress to what are some fairly urgent and important problems. So the first is, I think we need to be sort of thinking about new questions, raising new questions. fundamentally new questions in science. And why do I think that's important? I'll come to why in a moment, but I think this really sums up what we need to know about the importance of new questions. So, formulation of a problem is often more essential than its solution, which can be merely a matter. This is from 1937. Than its solution, which may be merely a matter of mathematical or experimental skill. If this were 2009, Einstein would probably have said data management skills as well. To raise new questions, new possibilities, to regard old problems from a new angle requires creative imagination. Doesn't say anything there about petabytes of data, and marks real advance in science. It's interesting because I watched those wonderful lectures of Richard Feynman on this Project Tuva thing that Microsoft had done, which is just amazing. And Feynman gives essentially a similar quote to this. And they're two people who are difficult to ignore. So, raising new questions is basically a new possibilities. The interesting thing about this is an interesting one. This new possibilities is an interesting one. We have someone in my lab, Drew Purvis, who's keen on building models that everyone says can't be built. And Drew's view is, I don't know why they can't be built, because who said they can't be built? And that is an issue about tools and data, which I'm going to come to in a moment. But I think one thing that software is doing, and data, is enabling, but not just those, is enabling us to actually think about entirely new possibilities that would have been unimaginable and impossible just a few years ago. So, new questions come from, I think, people with a different way of thinking. I'm not claiming that I'm certainly not claiming that I'm one of those, but there are some people in my lab who I do think are new kinds of scientists. But probably the most important of them all is the girl on the end, so scientists that are not yet fully made or formed, and that comes down to largely people like you and people like you in this room who are creating the next generation of scientists. And I think certainly in biology, and I've been on the receiving end of it in some sense, we've focused for certainly the last decade on training scientists to do things rather than what to think, and think fundamentally differently. I think that has to change. Anyway, that's a different talk altogether about how to create a new generation of scientists. But the ability to raise new questions comes from new kind of scientists with a different way of thinking about the world. And I think we have some of those. We're not the only people, but we do have some. The second thing we need in addition to raising new questions is to develop a formal, precise language with which to formulate those questions properly, so that we can kind of enable others to actually, examine the new questions that we would ask. Going back to Paul Nurse, in this article that he wrote, I think this was Nature, July 2008. Or maybe 9. So Paul Nurse won the Nobel Prize in 2001 with Tim Hunt for his work on cell cycle. I think he's now head of Rockefeller Institute or something. Very nice chap, a bit eccentric. So, in the gist of this article was that we need a better understanding. Despite 50 years of spectacular success in molecular biology, we have absolutely no idea even how a cell works. And this is someone who's won the Nobel Prize for understanding cells. We need a better understanding of living organisms through the development of appropriate languages to describe information processing in biological systems. I think the only thing I would take issue with here is I would substitute explain rather than describe information processing systems. But it's a nice quote, and I think it's spot on. The good news is that basically forms the foundations for much of what we do in my lab, whether it's at a single cell level or whether it's at a plant level. So understanding how plants make decisions, interestingly, why they make decisions. So what might such a language look like? Well, it certainly needs to be formal, needs to be precise, needs to be automatically translatable into machine executable code to actually make it run on a computer. It needs to enable simulation and analysis. It needs to be capable of representing processes of systems that are inherently complex, concurrent, reactive, so living things. And a good candidate for such a language, it's not the only one, I admit, But a good candidate for such a language is based upon process calculi, which is where we've placed most of our bets in terms of languages. And that comes in various forms, whether it's stochastic pi calculus or whether it's interacting stochastic automata. And again, I'm happy to answer questions on any of this lot, given the disgraceful cursory nature I'm giving to any of these issues. But in order to get through the whole thing, I just need to do that. Well, if I just stopped apologising and get on with it, I'd give it a bit more time. Anyway, so the instantiation of this language into a programming language is something that we're focusing on, that basically forms the foundations of much of what we do. And in its initial life, this thing is called stochastic pi machine. It's a programming language for, you might want to think of the codification of nature. It's been developed largely by Andrew Phillips, based upon some initial work by Luca Cardelli that started from some work by Regev and Shapiro, Weizmann Institute. And the interesting thing about this is that it contains all the things that biologists are not frightened of. So visual editing, visual programming, because one of the things that's important for this in actually developing such a language is it has to be usable. So we spent a lot of effort on making these things highly usable. All these things are familiar to biologists in terms of symbolic notation and description. It's very early days for this, but I'm just saying we're making a start. I don't know where it'll go. But in a very short period, there's something like 5,000 people using it, which is not bad. So the third thing we need is models. And I would say that the importance of models can't be overstated. We're all modelers, whether we build models or not. If we have some idea, we have an internal model of it. What modeling does is make those internal assumptions that scientists or economists or drivers make explicit rather than implicit and unclear in formal modeling. The other thing to say about the importance of models is when it comes to the systems that we're talking about, highly concurrent, highly dynamic, highly reactive natural systems that have processes that operate across multiple scales, we need multi-scale modeling, and that's an enormous challenge. And certainly we're finding it a challenge. But I'm going to show you some examples of where we think we're making some progress in building predictive, multi-scale models of complex natural systems in a moment. But this forms the basis of much of what we do. But it wouldn't be possible without language for building such models. Nor would it be possible without a pretty novel software environment. So we've got this software environment which is called Discovery, or it was up until recently. We were told we can't call it Discovery anymore for some reason. So Microsoft is going to do what Microsoft is really good at, which is calling it something that no one remembers, and it's, it'll have some name that no one really wants to remember. So this has been built by Martin Carlson, who gave a talk yesterday. I don't know if he's in the audience. Vasily Luchasev and Alex Brandl, largely. But the requirements for this have come from ecologists, zoologists, biologists, neuroscientists in my lab. So the interesting about this is we can take models. So here's, in this case, let's just take one example. Here's a model of what forests do. This has come from Drew Purvis, this perfect plasticity approximation model. We can then integrate that model, we can instantiate that model in this new software, which is this kind of easy to use, easy to create modeling environment for building and integrating multi-scale dynamic models. Even I can use it, so you realize just how simple it is. And it involves lots of reusable components, it's live, it integrates lots of heterogeneous data sources and data types very easily. Not as easily as we might like, but we're getting there. And then we can integrate something like a process of what forests actually do, process-based model, into a bigger model of, this is an Earth system model that we've created. We've built our own state-of-the-art Earth system model. I think it took us 2 or 3 days. It's a model that would have taken ordinarily, without this kind of software environment, years. It includes and brings in all manner of data from Hadley, from CRU, from elsewhere, from NOAA, from NCAR, but then we include our own modelling components to do with tree mortality, to do with vegetation. So we really have, in a very small number of days, built what may well prove to be one of the world's leading Earth system models. And then we can actually build. We can use this software environment to build other components. So this is a policy-driven component. So this is looking at if we take this model, how we can predict risks to food. So this is risks to crop production and agriculture in North America as a consequence of climate change, which we've done. Or we can just look at response of forests to climate change, or the response, or climate change as a function of responses to forests, which we've also done. So this software environment is quite important to us. It's not science, I admit, but we couldn't do the science without this kind of software environment. Gosh, just about got time. So in terms of the biology group, which I just wanted to give you a bit of a context about the languages and the software environment that instantiates these languages and the importance of modelling. So some examples, and I think I've got 6 examples in 15 minutes or so to go through in the areas that we're focusing on. So I suppose the biggest question for us is around biological information processing, and we're asking, I think, what are some interesting and important questions in trying to understand what does it mean, what does biological information processing mean. So the first question we're asking is, what does DNA compute and how? There's a third question, which is why, but I'll leave that for the moment. So this is some work done by Andrew Phillips, Simon Youssef, who's Andrew's student, Luca Cardelli, and Michael Peterson, who was an intern with us, who's now at Munich. And this is looking at strand displacement. I'm happy to talk about strand displacement after this talk if anyone wants to. But Andrew has developed this thing called strand displacement algebra, which enables us to fundamentally rethink what DNA computes, not just what it is, and how it computes it. And that's quite interesting. I should say additionally, this is the main motivation for this work, which falls into the category of synthetic biology rather than systems biology, is aimed at understanding how DNA computes things, and to some extent, and certainly to some extent why. But there's a reverse aspect of this, which is DNA at this point is basically programmable matter. And if we think about programmable matter, it's really kind of the only substrate that we've got that might be able to do computing in forms of computing that are currently impossible by engineering this and controlling it in novel ways. So there is every possibility that this kind of thing, this kind of work from Andrew and from Luca and others in the lab. Luca's not in my lab, he's a colleague of Andrew's though, could form the building blocks or the foundations of the building blocks for the next century of computing. So the second thing that we've been interested in is, what do stem cells compute? And that's interesting for a number of reasons. We're interested in just generally about cell cycles, cell differentiation and proliferation, but also because the idea of stem cells is, of course, a hot topic, has all sorts of ethical issues, which are, certainly in this country, which are, okay, it's not quite as bad now Obama's in, but still some thorny issues to get over. But more generally, it might underpin a revolution in medicine to do with regenerative medicine and artificial organogenesis or engineered organogenesis, for a whole range of things. And there's some pretty interesting information processing goes on in stem cells, in pluripotent stem cells. So we developed a model. This is using process-based algebra, but a lower level of abstraction here. And we use another tool here, which is a state transition network, to model and predict how stem cells make decisions about proliferation versus differentiation. And we built, as a consequence of that, this is work of Yaki Seti. I don't know why Yaki wants a photo of himself, which is a kingfisher or whatever it is, but there you go. And so we built this first predictive model of pancreatic organogenesis, which is quite interesting because it's now spurring on a number of experiments to test both the predictions and some also new data, sorry, no, I was going to say existing data, some new data that's come from microscopy, imaging, and some gene-based data on switching off particular genes and what the consequence of that is for pancreatic organogenesis from some colleagues in Weizmann. So the interesting thing about this is one of, we can't find any other literature about that's similar to this. So this is at least one of the world's first predictive models of organogenesis and how stem cells, what stem cells compute and how to determine cell proliferation and differentiation. The third area in biological information processing is what does the immune system compute? And again, this is work of Andrew Phillips with colleagues at Southampton, Johan Werner and Tim Elliott. Okay, it's a bit of a bold claim to say that we're trying to understand how the immune system works. We're not. But what we have done is look at what's one of the key parts of the immune system, which is class 1 MHC, major histocompatibility complex, antigen presentation. And Andrew has developed a predictive model using SPIM of peptide editing, and particularly the role and function of tapacin in peptide editing, based upon kinetic filtering. And this work, which has now been the predictions of this model, there was no data at all, but the predictions of this model have now been tested, and there's a paper in review, a couple of papers in review, on the results of that experimental work, showing that the predictions of this model are borne out, and that so what we have here is basically the world's first predictive model of class 1 MHC antigen presentation based upon this notion of kinetic filtering. Moving on to the ecology work, actually there's a very blurred distinction between the biology group and the ecology group, but moving on to the question of what the ecology group is mainly focused on, which is understanding, I don't know if that's the right term, but understanding life on Earth. So the first is, as I think I mentioned earlier, how do forests work? And that's a fundamental question, Earth system modelling and understanding Earth system regulation. And more importantly, being able to accurately predict changes to it and their consequences. So this is work of this remarkable young scientist, Drew Purvis. So he has this process-based model of what plants do. And I'm talking about raising new questions. The motivation for Drew's work is a stupid-sounding question, but it turns out to be a question which is fundamental, which is, what's the point of being a tree? And that sounds like a ridiculous question to ask, but it turns out to be a really important question, because you need to think about what decision-making processes a tree needs to make to actually even become a tree. It's to do with competition, it's to do with interaction with other trees. It turns out to be a fundamental question rather than a stupid question. And actually being able to actually formulate that precisely and concisely as a question into a process-based model of what trees do and forests do, communities of trees as forests, is a tremendously difficult job. And Drew is basically, I think, the world's leading authority on that area. And so he's built this process-based model of forest dynamics. We have these lovely visualizations of how trees interact, how they grow, how they compete for sunlight, tree mortality. In less than 2 years, he's had 2 papers in Science. He's actually had 2 papers in PNAS, a few papers in Proceedings of the Royal Society, as well as a raft of papers in top domain-specific journals on this area. So he's clearly doing something right. And then he's been using that work to address the second question that we're focused on, which is, what's the interaction between vegetation and climate? So again, it's the work of Drew, his postdoc Matt Smith, who is also an interesting chap, but also in working with the tools group with Vasily, Martin and Alex to develop this Earth system model which I mentioned earlier. What we've been looking at is what's the response of forests, remaining forests, to deforestation in Brazil, in the Amazon. It's not just Brazil, but larger Brazil, but the Amazon forest. And what's the consequences of that on climate change? So we actually have, this is actually hot off the press new science. And it's interesting because for the first time we've been able to predict that, I'm sorry a bit of this is cut off by the way, but we've been able to predict that currently soil and vegetation act as carbon sinks overall. But the rate at which, I'll briefly mention some of the parameters here. So we've taken a fairly benign scenario from IPCC and Hadley about carbon dioxide increase. So we haven't taken the worst case. We've taken into account population growth towards the end of the century. We've taken into account all manner of sort of, I suppose, sensible things about what we might expect in terms of carbon reduction, carbon credits, population growth, deforestation. We've taken a fairly benign view of deforestation, although it's still happening. But I think we've taken the current rate and reduced it by 0.1% per year from current rates, which we have some evidence to suggest that that's probably reasonable. So, consequence of that, we run this model. And you can see here that currently, which is correct, soil and vegetation act as a carbon sink, but sometime around, I think this is about 2040, vegetation no longer acts as a carbon sink and starts to act as a carbon source, which is very bad news. And as a consequence of that, we end up as, so these two models are kind of a non-process. This is a black box state-of-the-art model, and this is the process-based model of response of forests to response of remaining forests to deforestation and effect on climate change. What we can see is that our model predicts that as a consequence of what's currently going on in deforestation, taking into account a reduction in rate of deforestation, taking into account population growth, taking into account probably a slight reduction in CO2 emissions as a consequence of policy, we're still in trouble. So we have what's currently true, parts per million CO2 of about 340, and by the end of the century, the worst case goes up to 880, and in the most benign case, it goes up to 750 parts per million. And regrettably, what that means is that if this model is anywhere near correct, and it's as good a model as it gets, we think, is that, I'm not saying it's a good model, I said it's as good a model as it gets, they're two different things, is that we can expect a temperature rise of something like 6 degrees towards the end of the century, which largely makes the planet uninhabitable, which isn't great, so we need to do something about that. So the third question we're asking in this whole Earth system stuff is how do species and ecosystems interact and function? So this is the work of Rich Williams and Greg McInerney. Their work has also been published in PNAS, Precision Law Society, some more papers in PNAS in review. So this is kind of looking at how species distribution, species interaction, and we're only just beginning to scratch the surface of this because it's very difficult to understand. Interestingly, this is an area where there's enormous amounts of data on species distribution from satellite data, but it doesn't tell us anything about what we need to know, which is species interactions. So there's virtually no data on species interaction. Where that data exists, it's very thin on the ground, there isn't much of it, and it's highly heterogeneous. And making something of that data is very difficult. But building models of this and then thinking about the data that one needs to actually falsify the model is where we're at. But that gets us into all sorts of interesting areas, which I'm not going to talk about today, about novel forms of data acquisition. Okay, I'll briefly talk about this. So the final thing is what's the population dynamics of species and ecosystems over space and time. This is work of Matt Smith. Again, we've got some papers in PNAS published. So this is looking at, for example, enable us to answer as a function of, or enable us to predict, as a function of, for example, climate change or species change or ecosystem change, what are the population dynamics between species and how might pandemics occur as a consequence of changes in species, how might species loss occur, and how might invasive species propagate through an environment. That little thing that you saw there is actually a recent thing, which is this is work that Matt's been doing with with Andrew Phillips. I mentioned earlier, this developed the process algebra-based programming language, and this is looking at a synthetic ecosystem, entirely synthetic, so you can choose the parameters of your species, the population, all the rest of it, and this is just modelling the actual population dynamics. This is for an invasive species, but this enables us to do what you might want to call impossible experiments, in silico experiments, based upon properly parameterized knowledge and data about a particular species. So, in my remaining 2 minutes, I just want to kind of sum up. So, first of all, I want to apologise for a ludicrously brief and kind of shallow run-through of my lab's work. I haven't done justice to anybody who's doing that work, so my apologies to them more than to you. But and I'm happy to take questions. One thing I do want to say is that, in summing up, is that I think that the challenge of understanding complex systems is undoubtedly the greatest challenge that we face, both certainly from a scientific point of view, but also from a societal point of view, for all the reasons that I've very briefly gone over. Do I think data is important in that? Of course, I think it's vital. But the interesting thing is, I think the more important question than data, or the data that we have, or what do we do with petabytes of data, and challenges in data, in managing petabytes of data, are unquestionably enormously important challenges and enormously important problems that we need to get on top of. But I think there's a bigger problem than managing the petabytes of data that we've got, which is understanding what data we need. And that's an issue of understanding what questions we need to ask, and understanding how to ask the right question. And I think understanding what questions we need will inform us enormously, or asking new questions, not just about what we do with the data that we've got, but what data do we need to test models, to test theory. And so in a world of data-driven science, I would like to sort of be an advocate for science-driven data. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for a very stimulating run-through of the... I'm not sure you gave any solutions to this very depressing scenario you painted.
I said it was a bit short on answers.
Indeed. Anyway, so Stephen's happy to take some questions, so the floor is yours. Jeff.
So, in this issue of trying to generate the science that tells us what kind of data to collect, in the models, are the issues that we don't understand the processes, or that we're not able to scale the processes? Because there's always the risk of typically we deal with model resolution, and the question we always face is, does that, by refining resolution, do we simply solve the wrong equations more precisely, versus are we really not having the wrong equations in the model? So an example was this in the purpose citation that you gave. The increase you're proposing in the Earth's carbon content of the atmosphere is rather startling. Given that there's more carbon in the atmosphere already than there is in the terrestrial above-ground biomass. So if you burned all the forest on Earth, you would not double CO2 in the atmosphere. Okay.
Well, we don't.
And so, is there what is it that is going on in these models? Are you introducing some processes that are different, say in bringing carbon from the soil, or is it a scaling problem?
Both. I think we do face some scaling problems. Are we bringing processes from the soil carbon?
Well, the question is, how are you getting so much carbon into the atmosphere?
Right.
Because you can't get it just from the vegetation in the Amazon.
No. Well, I mean, I think this comes as it's been surprising to us, and the issue, you know, I don't think we don't have a precise understanding of how much carbon trees sequestrate at the moment, and
there's only about 500 gigatons of carbon in the trees.
What we have a very poor understanding of, and one of Drew's colleagues, Rosie Fisher, who's now gone to New Mexico, but she was at Hadley up until recently, is studying is what happens to the carbon in roots, and we have a very poor understanding of what happens to carbon in roots, and of course the root system is very different in different types of trees. But no one has a good understanding of that. But what we've done in this model is take our best information from both Rosie and from Drew of what happens to tree carbon in roots and as a consequence of deforestation. And I think that's one of the things that produces this kind of dramatic increase from around 2040 of vegetation going from a carbon sink to a carbon source. The whole issue about tree mortality is not one that I think anyone has a good understanding of. And some work that actually Catherine Manningham is doing here in the States, but I think there's going to be starting to work with Drew and with another person in my lab, Rich Williams, is on understanding how we can take data from forest inventory data and understand. Because I'm actually not sure I agree with you that we have a very good understanding of how much carbon there is, terrestrial carbon there is if you chop down every tree. But Catherine is I think really tackling this problem about forest inventory, or trying to tackle the problem of forest inventory as a source of data to actually parameterize these models much better.
Well, go on debate later on. Yes. Ellen.
I just want to make that. Thanks. I just want to clarify that you didn't say we shouldn't say that. You know, the oceans are the most of the part of the planet. It's just for some audience
right.
that may not resonate. But I also want to say I agree with the whole complexity issue. And a great example is with the coccolithophores. There's some research that suggests under more acidic ocean waters, they're going to be more productive, which is exactly opposite of our logic.
Absolutely.
That, you know, they should have a problem
right.
with dissolution and creating a calcium carbonate skeleton.
Right.
So I think the natural world is much more complex than we think it is in our understanding.
Right.
So it's nice to see, you know, how we get after that.
Right. Oh, I think all I mentioned in there was we don't know what they do, which is what you're saying, and it's, you know, we've got all this LiDAR data, you know, as I say, we're measuring the wazoo out of everything, but we have no idea what coccolithophores actually do in communities. We don't have a good understanding of how they're going to respond to ocean acidification. And there's plenty of evidence to show that there's going to be a decalcification, there's going to be a big problem, and there's emerging evidence that actually that might not be true for some species of coccolithophores. Similarly with trees, you know, we actually don't know whether trees are going to somehow respond to temperatures by growing faster and sort of continue to sequestrate more and more carbon. Well, it's unlikely.
Yeah. Well, I mean, part of the problem is that the change in the atmospheric profile tends to boil a lot of that extra carbon out of the boundary.
Right.
In other words, a tree can only photosynthesize carbon that's CO2 that's there.
Right.
And so, I mean, the biosphere is trying to take up the air.
Yes.
Because the amount of extra carbon we're producing, only about half of it is going into the atmosphere.
Right, right.
So the biosphere is trying to do that.
Right. That's what I'm saying, I mentioned earlier, is it's acting as it's managing to continue to act as a very good carbon sink at the moment. So I think that's precisely your point, yes.
One issue, both for data and for models, is noise, or if you will, uncertainty. I'm just curious on your take on that. Your models naturally ingest and enjoy uncertainty and noise.
You don't need to repeat it. I got the question, David. Yes, our models are full of uncertainty. I think any science without uncertainty you should stay clear of. So Of course, there is lots of uncertainty in our models. But of course, as a machine learning person, being able to quantify that uncertainty is one of the key issues. And we have a lot of standard Bayesian techniques for trying to quantify the uncertainty in both models and the data. Noise is an interesting one, particularly in biological systems, whether it's an intrinsic noise or extrinsic noise in biology in any way. But that's a different topic that you're talking about.
A couple of last questions.
Both omic as well as system biology modeling.
Right.
For lower level, as small as the metabolomic pathway modeling, bigger as what you talked, the last one, the population dynamic modeling. One of the issues we're running into is there are not enough data. So when we actually build a model, not only the model, the data mining model seems to overfit to the data,
right.
but also the real dynamic modeling you're trying to do, which actually we have tried for 5 years, also seem to overfit.
Right.
And so as a result of it, when you have more data, then the model doesn't work anymore.
Right.
So I want to hear your wisdom or insight on how you actually handle such
wisdom. Well, I can't do wisdom, I'm afraid. How do we? Well, I think it's an interesting one because it's a classic case where there's an absolute abundance of data. It's just probably not the right data, and it gets back to this question I'm talking about that I mentioned at the end, which is understanding what data we need, and it's actually still not clear. I think what data we do need to solve your problem is a critical issue, and that's an issue of being able to identify and ask the right question to understand what data we need to. And I don't know what the right question is in that case, really. But it's interesting because a lot of my colleagues, ex-colleagues, collaborators are trying to tackle this issue about pathways and networks and all the rest of it from a theoretical perspective, from a modeling perspective, from an experimental perspective. And they're all now saying, all this data that we've got is probably actually, not very useful. And that could have been avoided by asking the question, what is it that these networks are for and doing, or what they're computing, rather than just how they're all connected.
Example is a similar issue.
Yes, absolutely.
And then before you collect enough data, whatever your model you're making and you're building probably is overfitting to whatever.
Right.
And then it may not work for the global.
Well, it may not. But at least that population dynamics stuff at least enables us to precisely say what data we need in order to actually test the model. But the spatio-temporal dynamics of populations is an interesting one. Sorry.
I'm Jane Hunter from the University of Queensland. My question is associated with what data we need, and I would suggest that there's a critical type of information that we're missing that will have the most impact if you want to have an impact on the policymakers. And that's recording the management actions and the investment in management actions. So the people I'm working with, they want to know that if I invest $5 million in the next year in riparian revegetation or wastewater retreatment plants, what impact is that going to have on the bay, on the prawn industry,
right.
on the seagrass coverage and the dugong population? And then they want to see the results, so you have to link that to the actual observational data and the models.
Right.
And then if they can see that it's actually having an impact, then they'll be willing to invest greater amounts of money, another $10 million in
right.
greater riparian revegetation.
Right.
And I think that's a critical type of information that we're missing if you really want to have an impact on decision making.
I would agree with all of that. We do spend a lot of time on trying to make sure that the work that we're doing has policy relevance and policy importance. I would be the first to own up and say that we probably work on a slightly different timescale than is useful for policy making, for questions that policymakers want answering now. The problem with that is that I think it was either Jeff or someone mentioned yesterday about science of applications and one thing or another. And I agree with all that. And Ellen mentioned something about, we need to make decisions now. I don't know how Jeff feels about this, but it's a trade-off between, there's no point in going to policymakers and say, just give us 20 years, we'll come back with the answer. But there's a danger in that, in actually saying, well, are we making policy recommendations without understanding enough about the system? And I think we know so little about the system, that's just not to say nothing, but we know so little about the system and all the kind of, the interactions that I think we are in danger of, certainly in big areas to do with carbon credits, capture and storage, all the geoengineering stuff, fisheries. I mean, there's some basic stuff you can do with fisheries. It's pretty obvious we're doing overfishing and all the rest of it. And pollution is an easy one to sort of tackle, but there's more systemic stuff is a more difficult one. I don't have the answer. I think saying to policymakers we haven't got the answer, come back in 20 years, they're going to say, well, why are we doing all this science? And saying to them, here is the answer, and it doesn't work, or it's the wrong answer, or even the wrong question, is equally problematic. I mean, I think it gets back to some of the things that David said. I think being able to quantify uncertainty in one's, but not just predictions, but one's policy recommendations is critical in this area. And there aren't any, right. There's no ideal answers in this, for all the reasons that Jeff mentioned yesterday.
Thank you very much. So we've had a very stimulating talk. I should add that of the 800-odd PhD researchers in Microsoft Research, there are only 2 groups who are doing sort of multidisciplinary scientific questions. One is led by David Heckerman, the eScience group over in the West Coast, and the other is Stephen's Computational Science Lab. So I think it's good that Microsoft Research has at least 2 small groups actually looking at these rather major issues, because they're clearly going to be important to all of us. So can we thank Stephen for a very stimulating talk.